story for you today is called The Last Late Show with My Father. My father was Irish, and he was a salesman. And late in his life, I found a very small piece of paper tucked in the back of his wallet, and it was a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper that was folded down into 16ths and tucked in the back. And on it, in an old manual typewriting, was 20 to 30 of these joke summaries, right? And they were all lined up, and there'd be a little hint about the punchline and stuff. And he had carried this for decades as part and parcel of his work as a salesman. I think it was indicative of the fact that he loved to tell stories and he loved to connect with people. And my father had this gift that when he connected with you, he took such pleasure in that moment that you felt like you were standing in warm sunshine. And it was a powerful experience, and it wasn't fake and it wasn't contrived. When he had it in him to connect, it was a wonderful thing. My parents divorced when I was 7 years old, and he disappeared. He dropped off the face of the earth in that moment. And it's an interesting sentence, my parents divorced. It's a little like Hiroshima got bombed. You know, it doesn't really do justice to the complexity of the outcome. But my father and my mother divorced, and they did the classic 60s hateful, argumentative, binary, nasty divorce. And he, shortly thereafter, took a sales job in the Middle East selling oil field equipment. So he was gone for a number of years. And when he left, I think a very large part of me left with him. And I missed him more than I can possibly say. And at this point, I don't remember much about that part of my life. It's as if I simply refuse to remember it, the loss of him. A little while ago, I sat down to write about my father, and to my surprise, a story popped up, full-blown, completely there in all details, from when I was 4 or 5 years old. And the story goes like this. When I was a little kid, my parents would put me to bed. I don't know, my brother and I would be put to bed maybe 7:30 in the evening. My brother, he was a sleeper, but I was a listener. So he would go to sleep, and I would lay there listening to the sounds inside and outside of our house. And the funny thing was, like, if a car drove by on our little quiet suburban street in Houston, something about the sound of that car going by made me feel so safe and at peace, as if that car was going by just for me. And I would lay there and listen to the air conditioner switching on and off next door. And then I would hear the sounds in the house start to quiet down, and my older sisters would go to bed, and then my mother would go to bed. And then my father would sit up watching TV, and I could hear the muffled sound of the television. And at some point, he would get up and go into the kitchen and make himself a milkshake. Back then, we made milkshakes out of something called melarine, which apparently, as I understand it now with a little research, was a byproduct of the cottonseed oil industry after the Second World War. The demand dropped off from the War Department, so some enterprising cottonseed manufacturers figured out how to make ice cream without butterfat. They would put cottonseed oil in, and that was melarine, and we loved it. And he would turn on this old Osterizer blender with the big black lid on top, and for about a minute it sounded like he was grinding human teeth in the kitchen, and then it would shut off. And at that moment, I would get up and creep out of my bed and sneak past my brother's bed and go to the door and just open it an inch. And I honestly don't remember when I got the gumption to do this the first time, but it happened a number of times. And I would peek down the hall, and there at the end of the hallway of this classic 50s ranch-style house would be the couch, and my father sitting there with a golden light behind him from the lamp, and he would gesture for me to come. He could see this little eye looking out. And so I would creep into the hall very quietly and close the door, because I certainly didn't want my brother to catch on that this was even possible to be done. I'd close the door, and I'd race down the hall and jump on the couch. And there next to him at the little table next to the sofa would be 2 milkshakes, one for him and one for me. And I would tuck myself in under my father's arm, and we would watch The Late Show together. And The Late Show in Houston in the 1960s was just a local television program where they'd run old movies from the 40s and 50s. And they had a title card that had a little drawing of a nighttime city with some stars and a moon, and then it would say The Late Show. And there was a song that came on when they did this little title card, and it went like this. The Late Show. Nothing could be finer than The Late Show. Nothing could be greater than the greatest of stars right on your own TV. It was kind of a Lemon Sisters thing, you know. It was a kind of a jazz hands moment. And I remember that song to this day. And I don't remember years of my childhood thereafter, but I remember that song. And I also remember sitting there tucked under my father's arm with this glass with this milkshake in it, and I would look down into the glass. I can see it today, and the clumps of milkshake as I sipped away at it, with the little fissures and cracks as it settled into the bottom. Sometimes I would drink that milkshake quickly because it was so good, and other times I would drink it slowly because I didn't want to get sent back to my bed yet. And my father and I would sit watching these big bulbous automobiles, you know, with gangsters firing machine guns out the window, racing around on the TV screen, or cowboys riding through the Old West, or whatever it was. And eventually I would find myself sitting there with an empty glass growing warm in my hands. And my dad would say, "Okay, buddy, off to bed." And I would hand him the cup, go back down the hall, get in my bed, and go to sleep. Later in life, in my 20s, my 30s, my 40s, my father and I reconnected, and we had a lot of wonderful times together. We smoked cigars and drank tequila and hung out, and it was a terrific relationship. But about 6 months ago, it became obvious to me that my father was getting extremely ill and was probably going to die. And in the moment that this became clear to me, with the help of my lovely wife and the other people in my life, I was able to commit to going down and being with him. So I went to Houston, Texas, and I started doing hospice care for my father. And I got some help from an unexpected quarter. Out of the blue, this fabulous gay man named Gus Baca just dropped into my life, and he said, "Hi, he's my dad too, and your family, and I'm here to help." And I said, "Okay." Gus was not literally my father's son, but he was one of a group of gay men that my father and my stepmother became friends with up north at a B&B they used to go to regularly. And I once later asked my father why he was so comfortable with gay men. And his answer was very simple. He said, "They're not like this." I said, "Yeah, I know, it's true." And so Gus and I partnered to take care of my father, and we would sleep on the floor on these mattresses in the living room, and we would go into his bedroom and help him. We traded off. Gus would be there for a couple of weeks. I would be there. But toward the end of his life, we both stayed there together and helped him. And there is one single thing that my father did all the way up to the last moments of his life, and it's something that he did all his life. He joked with us. He told jokes, he made faces, he did little pantomimes. When his voice began to fail him, he continued to wink and whisper jokes. He did this because he was caring for us, even as we were partnering to care for him. He was telling us this is not so bad, and we can keep this light, and we can have a little fun, no matter what's going on. So Gus and I took care of him, and a couple of days before he passed, continuing to joke, and for example, one of the jokes he did regularly was we had these helicopters that would go over occasionally, and he would pull the sheets up like this, and he'd say, "They finally found me, hide me," you know, but a couple of days before my father passed, he asked the hospice nurse to marry him, and he wasn't asking her to marry him. He was joking about asking her to marry him, and she knew this. And she leaned down over him and she said, "There is not another man in the world I would even entertain that question from. But from you, yes, I'll marry you." And he whispered back, "I'll find a ring." And she and I left the room and went into the adjoining living room, and she put her hand over her heart and she said, "He breaks my heart." And I said, "Yes, he does." And so we stayed with my father, and his voice disappeared, and eventually he became unconscious. And a couple of nights later, and this was just a month ago, I woke up in the night, and I could hear him breathing, his laboring breathing. And so I went over to Gus Baca, who on his little mattress, and I touched his arm, and we got up and we went in and we sat with my father. And each of us took one of his hands, and we gave him morphine because his breathing was too fast. And we sat with him for an hour, and we told stories back and forth about him. And after another hour, we gave him another dose of morphine, a significant one. And his breathing finally slowed down a little bit. And although we didn't know it, these were the last minutes of his life. And in these last minutes, he cared for us in one more way. Gus and I, once he calmed down, decided to get up and go in the adjoining room and get a cup of coffee from the coffee maker. And we did that, and we told a couple of more stories while we were in there, and we were laughing a little bit quietly, and I'm sure he could hear us. And then I turned and I went back into the room, and my father was not breathing. And I looked to Gus, and I shook my head, and Gus came in past me, and he checked my father's pulse, and he said, he's gone, he's passed. And Gus, who has done, Gus is, by the way, never mind the fact that he's a registered nurse, retired registered nurse, dropped out of the sky. He had done hospice work, and the hospice nurse also told me, she corroborated this, that a lot of people wait till their loved ones are out of the room, even for 2 minutes going to the bathroom, to pass, because they don't want them to have to see it. So even in that final moment, my father had figured out a way to look out for us. And out of all this, I've come up with two stories. My father gave me a story when I was 5 years old that carried me through his absence because he had to go away for a while. And whether he knew it or not, that story was central to how I viewed myself as a person who was worthy of being loved and who was cared for and who could stand in the warm light. And now that my father has passed, I realize he's given me another story because he's had to go away again. And the story he has given me is not only that I am loved and that I can stand in that warm light, but that I can care for others and provide it for them as well. And it's a lesson I will never forget. And I thank you, Dad.